experts in child welfare, or some good experts in child welfare and children's issues, who are talking about how they're finding solutions to these problems, and I thought that was great, and that kind of inspired what we're doing today. And so then I'm lucky to have her and Emily here today, who I really think are, some of the standouts in the field. So thank you very much, and bouncing off of her data, what do you got to say?
Okay, well, thank you first. I'm really glad to be here. For a lot of reasons. One, to get to co-present with Emily is really fun, and I really believe in what Daniel is doing with his Fostering Media Connections and with this course. So I think that his effort to educate the media about child welfare issues and educate students who are going to go on and work either as journalists or in the field as policy makers, as social workers, is just enormously important. I think the media is important partly because I think there's a real need in the child welfare area for radical change. It's not as if a little bit of fixing here or there is going to solve what I see as the problem. So you need a real mindset change across a broad swath of the population to even hope to get anywhere. So that's part of why it's so important. There's another thing that I think all of you should think of in terms of why this work is important, which has to do with children and the sort of particular challenge of trying to represent in some way, because I think it's not just lawyers who represent, it's anybody who's out there saying we're going to try to improve social justice for a particular group, whether it's social workers, policymakers, lawyers, thinking, okay, so how do I make things better for this disempowered group? Now, all my life as a lawyer, I have basically thought what was interesting and worthwhile was working to try to leverage more power for the disempowered. So I worked doing civil rights work with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I started a public interest law firm designed to serve the interests of ex-offenders and ex-addicts, certainly pretty low on the totem pole. I really have come to think that children are the most challenging disempowered group. And I think it's hard to grasp often because we talk very often as if we all love children and as if best interest of the child is the working principle. But I think the longer I've worked in the child welfare area, the less I think it's true that the best interest of the child is the guiding principle, and the more I think that certain obvious things play out, namely that if you're too young to speak, demonstrate, vote, it's you don't have power, you depend on adults. And then what you get in this field is a lot of adults, and you have to have adults who are going to speak on behalf of kids. But the risk is you get adults who are promoting various adult agendas, not child agendas, and children become the pawns. I think, as I tell my child advocacy program students at Harvard Law School every year, this cause of child welfare deserves sort of the best minds, and to take on what is really a unique challenge. Related to that, I guess, is I remember things selectively, Daniel. So what I do remember about the first call was this sense that, oh, this is great. Here's this journalist who cares about these issues having to do with children. That's not enough. I need to talk to you longer, Daniel, because it's not enough that you care and that you care about kids and are going to go out and write some story. I want you to talk to me long enough so you're going to see things my way. And so hence the following invitations to the Racial Disproportionality Conference, and every chance I got to talk to Daniel, I wanted to take up, because really if he was going to do this work of fostering media connections, these kinds of classes, I wanted to work with him because there's choices out there which all of you will face. there are people with wildly different ideas about how to advance child welfare. And I would say the dominant ideas out there that, and this is part of why I think what Daniel's doing is so important, but also why it was so important that I talked to him at great length and as often as possible, is the dominant voices you will hear. I mean, if you just go out to do work in this field or do a story, what you will hear is the view that I profoundly disagree with, putting it in a simplistic way. So you will hear the dominant child welfare line, and the dominant child welfare line is very oriented, in my view, to adult interests, to parent autonomy, to parent rights to keep their family together, to family preservation. And that's the dominant view. And now, then you have to decide, maybe that's the right view. Daniel did, I think, want me to say something about my own history and how I got into this area, and that's fair, because what I'm going to talk to you about is what I see as bias in the research in this area, so you're entitled to know where I'm coming from, and I certainly have reasons for my own bias. So 27 years ago, I flew to Peru and adopted the first of 2 adopted children, so I became an adoptive parent. I really got into the child welfare field only then. I'd been the civil rights, employment discrimination lawyer before. I got into this field through my own adoptions. I'm also, I have a child by birth also, much earlier and older. But adoption made me think a lot about the meaning of the biological link between parent and child. Now, as I tell my students, you can see it either as bias. I mean, I come here to justify my own life. I'm for transracial international adoption. Or I like to think that I've gained a lot of insight by a very sort of deep and intimate experience through my own life, and also through fighting as an advocate ever since on these issues. So what I want to talk about today, so I was starting to say what you're going to find out there. So you find out there policy views, which I see as inappropriately biased in the direction of family preservation. You also find out there research, some of which I would say is good research, some of which is bad research. I think it's wonderful you're looking at social science in this course. It takes work to look at social science and learn, so here's the main thing I'm going to tell you. You have to learn to locate Emily's work and recognize Emily out there. And there are a lot of people who are doing very different kind of research, which is what I would call not good and often not even honest research. And it's not so easy to tell the difference, although it's also not impossible. I'm not trained as a social scientist at all. I self-taught myself, and I think I've learned to read social science. So another thing you need to be aware of is that many people who are promoting, and of course the most powerful organizations are the ones that are doing the most promoting of their views of the policy, a lot of these people are enormously sophisticated. I mean, we are talking in the policy advocacy world in large part about very sophisticated, hugely rich foundations that, good thing that they care about child welfare. They, I mean, when I first read, when I was looking into intensive family preservation services, which I talk about which I think everybody recognizes now as the research scandal in that area. I read a strategy memo that was sort of internal to Edna McConnell Clark Foundation, which was promoting intensive family preservation services. And never in my 5 years at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which was a very sophisticated social change organization, but never had I seen anything as sophisticated in terms of how to make intensive family preservation services become the program of the nation as this strategy memo by this foundation. And believe me, they targeted the media. I mean, you know, they targeted academia, they targeted the media, they targeted the politicians, they had it all worked out. And so, you know, it's wonderful that Fostering Media Connections is thinking about how to marshal the media as a force for good, but believe me, lots of organizations out there are smart enough to have figured out that the media is a really important thing to get on their side. So you need to probe deeply and figure out what's really going on, what's the right position to, in my view, really be fighting for children in this area. So that's why I called my talk, and the article that I gave you to read, Creating a Child-Friendly Child Welfare System. So it's supposed to be a child welfare system. My sense is it isn't designed as if child welfare is the central goal. It ought to be. Everybody claims that it ought to be, but I don't think it is. I think it's often anti-child. So time is racing by. I want to say just a few words about overall policy. Why do I say that? I think it's too oriented in the direction of family preservation. Just a few words on sort of overall this area. So, child maltreatment. Just to back off for a second. What is it? How bad is it? Should we see it as a major problem for children and society? And I think, yes, that it's not only a lot of it going on, Emily's data really informative that way. But if you look at the social science on what happens to kids who are identified as victims of abuse and neglect, lifelong ramifications. It's not so easy if it goes on, if the abuse, neglect goes on for a significant amount of time, it's not so easy to remedy those things. So what are my views of what we should do about it? If I'm critical of the child welfare system, what do I think are good forms of solutions? So very briefly, I think one, and here I agree with many people on the other side of the debate I engage in constantly, but I think a serious anti-poverty program, we used to talk about it in this country, a war on poverty, but a serious anti-poverty program would be the best anti-child maltreatment program. So we need to do that. There's then the problem of what do we do in the meantime, because sadly that's not going to happen tomorrow. So then I think early targeted support for the kids that we know, again, I'll cite Emily's data, are at high risk for maltreatment. Early targeted support, things like early home visitation, certain models which really have been shown by good social science to work to reduce maltreatment, and to help the parents get into employment and things that make their lives better, which is part of why it helps reduce maltreatment. And then I think we need a more active interventionist coercive system, so that when we identify kids as actually victimized by abuse and neglect, I think way more often than in today's world, we should have a CPS, child protective system, that intervenes forcefully, in the sense of either forcefully saying, you get into drug treatment, you get off of drugs, and only if you do in a timely way do you keep your child, that kind of coercive intervention, or coercive in the sense of we remove the child to foster care, and then I would say more often by far than in today's world, I would move kids on relatively early to adoption. Adoption is miraculously, compared to most social intervention programs, actually works really well for kids. I think all the social science shows that kids adopted at birth do essentially as well as any kid brought up by a biologically linked parent. Kids adopted after serious damage has been done to them are able to repair a lot of that damage. So what I think...
Betsy, I'm sorry to jump in, but
yeah.
just quickly, I mean, when it comes to the adoption data, I mean, on the back end, we don't track adoptions out of foster care that well, do we?
Well, there certainly are relatively high failure rates of adoptions, I mean, meaning 15% range of kids out of foster care. But I would say, you know, the more damage that's done to kids, the less like, I mean, the thing that shows up over and over in adoption studies in terms of how well adoption works is nothing to do with home studies and screening and all the stuff they put adoptive parents through. It's age of child at time of placement. That is the single best by far predictor. You know, I could take more questions, but I'm just really
Yeah,
worried
sorry.
since you've given me 12 more minutes.
No, to go through, I'm sorry to
But
interrupt.
I wanted to know, it's a
Keep on
really good
rolling.
question, but there's more questions, and I
Yeah.
know there will be. So why don't I just defer questions so that then all of you can have at Emily and me. So, and I'm gonna try to talk faster than Emily, but at least I can do that. So the thing that I think doesn't work very well is one of the major ways in which our coercive system now operates. And you saw again this in some of Emily's data. So what doesn't work well is when we identify kids who've been abused and neglected, and the system intervenes and says, gee, let's make all efforts to keep those kids at home, almost always, which is what we do almost always. Almost however bad the situation is. And then the system says, well, when it's really bad, let's do services. That doesn't work typically. So that's why you get 1/2 to 2/3 of the kids who are identified as abused and neglected, kept at home, given services, even in model programs, they get re-abused and neglected. Now to me, the statistic, you know, re-abuse in 1/2 to 2/3 of the cases is not just depressing, it's an outrage. I mean, that to me is criminal. If we did that to an adult, let's take adult female victims of domestic violence, if we said, hey, in 1/2 to 2/3 of the cases, we're gonna insist you go back home. I mean, in all the cases, almost all the cases, we insist you stay at home, even though that's gonna be the result, you know, there'd be a lot of outrage. But we do it with kids, so those systems aren't working. And I think it's obvious why they're not. When parents who normally love kids are at the point, which is usually because I think of serious drug and or alcohol abuse, that they seriously abuse and neglect their kids, which really isn't, in many ways, unnatural thing. It is not so easy to get over whatever leads to them, too bad. So I think that's part of why that form of intervention, which is our current system's more or less favorite, isn't working. So what I want to do is say, if you want to know more about my thoughts on policy, read Nobody's Children, and which is my book, and on that topic. And now I want to say some things about research.